A boy is running barefoot through a dirt street, chasing a ball made of stuffed socks and newspaper. He cannot afford a real one. He does not know that the same feet will one day be insured for millions, that presidents will wait for him, that his name will become the single most recognized word in the sport he loves. Right now, he is just hungry, and he is just playing. What happens between that street and the top of the world is not a story of luck. It is a story of what a person does when they have nothing left to lose.
He was born Edson Arantes do Nascimento on the 23rd of October 1940 in a small town called Três Corações in the Brazilian state of Minas Gerais. There was no sign in that moment that the world would ever learn his name. His father, João Ramos, known to everyone as Dondinho, had once dreamed of his own career in football. He was a decent player, disciplined, technically sound, but injuries and circumstance kept him from ever becoming more than a name in local matches. His mother held the household together, the quiet force behind a family that had very little to spare. The boy grew up watching his father's unfulfilled dream up close, without knowing yet that he would be the one to finish it. What nobody could have predicted was how much of his father's failure would end up fueling his own hunger. Dondinho, for all that football had denied him, gave his son what he had left: knowledge. He taught the boy the fundamentals, the discipline, the way to read a game before a ball ever arrived at his feet. It was not gentle instruction. It was a father pouring everything he never got to use into someone who might. Through that guidance, the boy moved from street games into organized youth football, eventually catching the attention of scouts connected to a professional club on the coast, Santos. What began as a man teaching his son in the dirt outside their home would, within a few short years, put that same boy inside a professional stadium. The question was no longer whether he could play. It was whether the sport itself was ready for him. He joined Santos as a teenager, stepping into a dressing room full of grown men who had spent years earning their places. There was no gradual introduction. He scored his first professional goal before he had even turned 16, announcing himself not as a promising trainee, but as a threat defenders had to account for immediately. In a sport built on experience, here was a boy barely out of childhood, forcing his way past that hierarchy through sheer performance. It was one thing to dominate street games against other children. It was another to do it against professionals who had every incentive to shut him down. He did it anyway, and this was only the opening chapter of what he was about to do on the world's biggest stage. In 1958, Brazil traveled to Sweden for the World Cup, and a 17-year-old from Três Corações went with them. Brazil had never won the tournament. The pressure on that squad was immense, and yet it was this teenager who became the difference. He scored a hat-trick in the semifinal and added 2 more goals in the final itself, helping Brazil lift their first World Cup title. Overnight, a boy who had been selling tea and playing with a sock stuffed with newspaper became a name known across the planet. This was not the slow climb of a career player easing into relevance. It was a sudden, violent shift from anonymity to global fame, and it happened before he was even old enough to fully understand what it meant. But if the world thought it had seen the peak of what he could do, the next tournament would remind everyone that greatness does not travel in a straight line. 4 years later, at the 1962 World Cup in Chile, disaster struck. An injury in the second match of the tournament forced him out, and he was unable to contribute meaningfully to the rest of Brazil's campaign. For a player whose identity had become tied to inevitability, to being the answer whenever his team needed one, this was a brutal reminder that the body has limits. Fame cannot override. Brazil still won the tournament, proving the squad's depth, but it also proved something else: that even without their brightest star on the field, the team he had helped build a reputation for could still succeed. For him personally, it raised a harder question, one that follows every athlete who has tasted the top. What happens when the body fails before the ambition does? By this point, he was no longer just a footballer. He was a symbol, and Brazil's political leadership understood the value of that symbol. The military government of the era recognized the propaganda power of sporting success and was not shy about using football's triumphs and the athletes behind them to project a certain image of the nation to the world. Living inside that dynamic meant carrying more than the expectations of fans. It meant his image, his success, and his public conduct were being watched and used in ways far beyond the sport itself. Few teenagers are prepared for global fame. Even fewer are prepared to have that fame folded into a nation's political identity. He had to learn to carry both in real time with no precedent to follow. Across club and international football, credible estimates place his career goal tally somewhere between 1,280 and 1,283, scored across roughly 1,360 matches, though the exact figures depend on whether friendlies and exhibition games are counted alongside official competitions. Whichever methodology is used, the scale of it borders on the unbelievable for a single career. He spent nearly 2 decades at Santos from 1956 to 1974, transforming a Brazilian club into an internationally recognized name before closing his playing days with the New York Cosmos between 1975 and 1977, helping introduce the sport to a country that had never fully embraced it. From socks stuffed with newspaper to a scoreboard that struggles to be fully agreed upon, the distance he traveled is almost impossible to measure in ordinary terms. And yet the numbers alone were never really the point. Across club and international football, credible estimates place his career goal tally somewhere between 1,280 and 1,283, scored across roughly 1,360 matches, though the exact figures depend on whether friendlies and exhibition games are counted alongside official competitions. Whichever methodology is used, the scale of it borders on the unbelievable for a single career. He spent nearly 2 decades at Santos from 1956 to 1974, transforming a Brazilian club into an internationally recognized name before closing his playing days with the New York Cosmos between 1975 and 1977, helping introduce the sport to a country that had never fully embraced it. From socks stuffed with newspaper to a scoreboard that struggles to be fully agreed upon, the distance he traveled is almost impossible to measure in ordinary terms. And yet, the numbers alone were never really the point.